So hello and welcome, it's Neil Dougan here. This is week 8 and we're looking at the philosophy of brain chemistry. Now brain chemistry sounds very technical, and indeed it is extraordinarily technical once you get into the research that's going on around the world at the moment. However, for the purposes of what we're doing here in TRIM, the chemistry that we need to look at is relatively simple. And particularly what we're going to do today is we're going to focus on the aspects of the mind, or in other words, how we're thinking. So the thinking and the thoughts and the feelings and as well as the charges that go with our beliefs and so on, being affected by the chemistry of the brain. So firstly, let's have a look at the question of what's the difference between the brain and the mind. And I often will quote this to people when I'm talking to them. They'll say, well, where are memories stored, or where are your beliefs, or where is emotion actually in your brain, and can you point it to me, sort of thing. And if you ask neurologists that question, they'll shrug their shoulders. They have no way of actually answering that question, where a memory is really being held. Show me, if you ask them, show me the formation of a thought within the brain. They can't actually answer that question. So we know that there is a very big difference between the mind and the brain, and indeed that modern scientific evidence can't actually point to us the origin or the definition or the placement of any of this thought or mind level of activity. In an earlier video we talked about the idea of a bottom-up causality or a top-down causality, and of course modern science is based on the idea that everything works from the bottom up. So you have matter behaving in certain ways and coming out of it, arising all the way at the top as consciousness, or these aspects of the mind that we're talking about at this level. And indeed, that a scientific view is that were there a God, that God would actually be created once again from the bottom up. So the difference between that model, the traditional scientific model, and the model that we're working with here in TRIM, and indeed throughout all these kinds of medical approaches that we are involved in, is a top-down one. So what we're looking at is a high level of organisation which devolves all the way down to matter. And this is the idea that our physical reality is actually an expression of consciousness. So the higher level consciousness actually expresses its reality as being the third dimension, or physical matter, the physical world, the physical universe around us. So what does all that mean for us here in terms of what we're doing with TRIM? It's an up and down process. So the feedback between the physical and the mind is continuous, and indeed the way in which the physical is organised has a tremendous impact on how the mind at a higher level is behaving. So the chemistry, what's happening with the chemistry within the brain, has the ability to have major impact on the success or otherwise that's actually going on with the mental level. Probably the most famous of all brain chemicals is cortisol, and it's known as the stress chemical. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these chemicals tomorrow when we're doing the science video. However, cortisol is a great example of a chemical which can have a dramatic impact on how our mind is working, so how our feelings are, how our thoughts, clarity of what we're doing, and so on. So as the big promoter of the stress reaction within the brain and indeed throughout the body, cortisol is an excellent example of a chemical that we can actually focus on within TRIM. So if we bring focus on the perfect balance and the perfect adaptation of cortisol, well then we're heading a long way down the track towards optimizing the experience that we're having. So another very famous chemical that operates within the brain is serotonin, and serotonin is famous for that sense of being uplifted. So this is a very common chemical within the brain which actually gives us a feeling of well-being. Now there is a huge range of classes of chemicals that are involved in the process of actually uplifting us, feeling as uplifted, and they're very specific to the kinds of moods that we're talking about. So there are very, very specific chemicals which have a tendency to create the conditions where the mind can actually be behaving in very, very specific ways as well. So allied to that, the idea of the serotonin and the well-being drugs, there's sort of internal drugs, if you like, chemicals within the brain. What we do with recreational drugs in particular, and it's not only recreational drugs, but obviously from a pharmaceutical perspective, people suffering from a broad range of mental disorders will be given pharmaceuticals to actually modify, in part actually modify some of these particular chemicals that we're talking about, but in addition they will simulate some of these these naturally occurring chemicals within the brain as well. So a great example, one that many people will be familiar with, is morphine, so a very common drug, and it's predominant component of heroin. And so these opiates, these sort of morphine based chemicals have analogues. They have similar chemicals which are built into our brain. And of course, the tragedy for drug users, people who become heroin addicts and so on, is that there is a much better way of actually achieving these kinds of outcomes that they were looking for, and they involve meditation and spiritual work, which will promote and increase the levels of these naturally occurring opiates within the brain without all of the disastrous side effects. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just actually briefly talk about some of the very common generic or class-based thought structures that we have going on within ourselves, and you'll identify immediately that these are things that are wonderful to be able to moderate, and there are specific brain chemicals actually involved in each of them. I'm not going to go through and list them one by one. In some cases there's overlaps and there might be multiple chemicals actually involved in them. But the principle is that there is chemistry associated with each of these mind states, if you like. So the first one is clarity. People on this TRIM program, many people who come onto this TRIM program, you may well be one of them, suffer from the difficulty with clarity of thought. So in other words, the whole thought process appears to be muddled or not clear, not well defined. Another really good one is the mind state of being confident. So when I say the word confident, that can sound wonderfully positive, but of course it has the other disastrous side effect when you are certain of things. So when you're absolutely certain about things and you dogmatically know whatever it is that you know, then the opportunities for things to be new to actually arise within yourself are severely limited. Nonetheless, there is a very specific chemistry, brain chemistry associated with being confident. So in other words, I have some certainty, I have heartfelt confidence in whatever it is that I'm saying, where I'm going, my direction, my purpose. Without some of this, you're not able to go anywhere, but with too much of it, then you become dogmatic and you get shut down. So all of these ones that we're going to talk about today have a dark side and a light side, if you like, to them. Another wonderful example is decisiveness. So being able to come to a conclusion and then make quick action, to take quick decisive action, has very specific chemistry associated with it. We spoke a few moments ago about the idea of clarity and being able to think your way through a set of thoughts. In other words, there's a clear progression of thoughts and it's completely clear for you. In addition to that, you want to be able to have focus. So focus is another area which is highly desirable and once again has a very specific set of chemistry associated with it. So we talked about confidence a moment ago, and what we can also talk about here is openness. So openness is partly the antidote to being overly confident, but openness itself has a completely different set of brain patternings and brain chemistry associated with it. So when you are open to new ideas, you have a very particular form of brain chemistry. Another marvellous thing to be able to have within yourself, within your kit bag, if you like, is to be creative. And when you're creative, you need to be able to bring in all kinds of stimulus from around you. So you have to have many of those other thought processes or mind states in operation, of course. But once again, creativity itself actually has very, very specific brain chemistry, and indeed the whole creative process has many pharmacological approaches to it as well. So people, when they're looking to be very creative, often are looking for particular pharmacological approaches. But once again, all of this chemistry is actually available inside your brain. It's just a matter of switching it on. Lastly, I want to have a brief look at the brain chemistry around common so-called mental illness. And you know, it's one person's illness is another person's gift, of course. And we may as well start with the most obvious expression, or most obvious example of what I'm talking about there, and that's schizophrenia. So sufferers of schizophrenia, whilst their quality of life can be severely diminished, can also have tremendous amounts of the sort of creativity that we're talking about. And many of the most famous artists that we are aware of over the past, centuries have been sufferers of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia has very, very complex chemistry associated with it, and is very, very difficult for the modern medical establishment to target, because it's just so difficult to actually stimulate the right part of the chemistry without overstimulating other parts of the chemistry. Once again, getting this in track is entirely possible within your brain. So your brain actually has all of the chemicals that are necessary to manage schizophrenia. So if you are a sufferer, or if you've got aspects of schizophrenia, then it is a matter of bringing the focus to the correct chemistry, bring the focus to the correct chemistry, and being able to also obviously do all of the other therapy work which is necessary to achieve a great result out of it. However, it's definitely possible to do tremendous amounts of work just by bringing the correct focus to the correct chemistry. I often joke about this in terms of schizophrenia, because if you have a look at a medical dictionary and what is the definition of schizophrenia, it's when people can no longer control time and space, and their orientation to time and space. Well, that's almost the definition to me of the kind of work that we do, is that we get into a position where we're able to actually move away from the constraints of time and space in the work that we're doing. So that's another amusing way of looking into a so-called pathology of schizophrenia. It's another incredibly common mental illness, or so-called mental illness, is depression. And once again, depression has very, very specific brain chemistry associated with it, and is a far easier target for pharmacology. So if you are a sufferer of depression, I'm sure at some stage or other in your journey you will have been subject to some kind of drug treatment for the condition, and you will know that it can have a tremendous impact actually on your mood, so on your the general well-being that you actually have within your system. So I'm not sure whether you've heard me talk about this before, but I'm somebody who suffered from clinical depression. So the timing of all of this was many years ago now. It's about 8 years ago. And indeed, it was the way in which I came once again back into this kind of work. So I'd had a hiatus away from doing this type of work, and was involved in some entrepreneurial activities, and which came well and truly unstuck. And the stress of it actually led me to fall into clinical depression. I became very, very sick actually. I had the great good fortune actually of meeting somebody who was doing this type of work that TRIM is based upon now, and I worked with her several times, and actually on the second time that I actually was having a treatment with this lady, I thought to myself, I have to learn how to do this. I need to learn how all of this works. And my journey for the last 8 years has been a series of steps, if you like, from that very point onwards. But I say that for a couple of reasons. One of them is that whilst I have absolutely no objections to people taking a pharmacological approach to depression, and indeed in many cases that may be the most wise thing to do, at least in the interim for a particular case, nonetheless in my own case, which was a very severe case of depression, I was able to actually treat it entirely, and nearly all of this actually within myself. So I was actually self-treating myself through this process, but I was able to treat it with this type of consciousness work very, very, very well, extremely successfully. The last so-called mental illness that I want to talk about is anxiety, and of course anxiety is often seen as being the precursor to depression. So people who suffer from anxiety for a long period of time, they get so much dysfunction within the brain and the balances of the brain chemistry. So we're talking about all of this brain chemistry that we've been referring to all the way through this conversation, in fact, this video today, becomes so dysfunctional that eventually the depression symptoms, in other words that mind level expression, begins to be expressed, if you like. So all that being said, that relationship to depression, anxiety in its own right is a very, very serious and very severe disease. And indeed, in my clinical experience, we're talking about people who come in here to the clinic, there's a very pronounced level of limitation that occurs in the person's life when they're a sufferer. And we've had a tremendous success rate with people with anxiety as well. So the precursors, the chemical precursors to all of that mental illness that we've been talking about, and all of the mind state matters that we were mentioning there earlier, all of them are targets within TRIM. So what we do is we actually focus on the proper functioning of all that brain chemistry, and we're really looking for a homeostatic set point, which is ideally suited to you actually being able to execute your life purpose. In other words, where you're going, so that you're able to take action, to be clear, to work your way through all of these things. So I hope you've found that very useful, and please, 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 if you are somebody who is suffering from one of these types of disorders that we're talking about, and you would like to share, please do so on the Facebook group TRIM, and I'll be sure to monitor that, and I will comment and assist. And indeed, if you wish to do so, you're very welcome to contact me directly, and we can talk through your particular issues that you're facing. So thanks for watching, and watch out for the science video. Thank you.